So I want to briefly go over another method for you to be able to transfer your chosen portrait image to your wood panel. This is not a requirement, but this method is very useful in helping you to blow up a photograph that maybe isn't a easy size to use that grid method we talked about on the previous piece. The triangle grid method is a type of proportional tool that allows you to blow up an image proportionally. This was very popular with the post-impressionists. Van Gogh was well known for taking tiny little sketches that were in his sketchbook and using this grid method to blow them up into larger paintings. The unique part about this method is it's very flexible. You can divide your image as many times as you want or as few times as you want. It just allows you to figure out the correct proportions without being as rigid as that square grid. People tend to have a strong preference. They really end up loving the triangle grid and using this more often, or they really love the square grid and use that more often. So this is just sort of another version of that grid that we learned about before, but it's a little bit looser. And it works really well when you have a canvas or a panel that you can't change the size of because all you have to do is just get your photograph proportional and you don't have to do any more measuring. So the first step in this process is for you to print your photograph and measure your photograph. Now you may need to crop your photograph so it's proportional to your 18 by 24 panel. What this means is that we can't change the size of the panel, so in order for this grid process to work, your photograph has to be proportional. So for example, if I printed my image 8 by 11, I'm probably going to have to crop my longer side 11 to make it proportional because it's just going to be a little bit too long. So to find out how to do that, I can set up a proportion. I can put 8 over x, x representing that side I'm going to have to crop, is equal to 18 over 24. I can cross multiply to solve for x. And when I work out that equation, my 11-inch side is going to actually be cropped to 10.67. Now the cool thing about the grid is you can kind of you could eyeball it around 10.6 or 10.5 and it'll still work out without kind of making any major issues with your proportions because that small amount is spread out over the entire grid. Now if you're using the square grid method, those little amounts actually matter a lot because they can be a big shift in one of your little squares. The triangle grid is a little bit looser and little small amounts don't matter as much. Okay, so to show you how to do this, I'm gonna get an image here. So you remember, like I said, I'm measuring it first. I'm gonna skip some of these measurements since we talked about it already. If you have a photograph that doesn't have a really defined edge, you're gonna want to draw an edge in. That way you can find your corners more easily. Because the first step in this process is actually just drawing a line from corner to corner of your image, not corner to corner of your paper, right? Because we're looking at the corner of the image. So I'm going corner to corner and then middle to middle. Now you don't have to measure your middle to middle. You could if it's easy, but if I've got a weird edge, it's like 10.67. It's actually easier just to eyeball it. Like I said, we are doing this sort of looser, so eyeballing works. Then I'm going to connect the middle. So I'm going to create a big diamond in the middle. So I go middle to middle to middle. And then I'm going to connect the centers of my x's. So middle of x to middle of x vertically, middle of x to middle of x vertically, middle of X to middle of X horizontally. Now at this point I could stop if I wanted to, if I have it divided enough so I can see. But I also might want to think about some areas that maybe aren't divided enough. Like, for example, in this case, the hands and the feet maybe aren't quite giving me enough proportion. So I can actually go into those individual triangles and divide them more. I can do this as many times as I want in as many areas as I want, as long as I repeat this on my canvas or board. So you can do this wherever you want. Now, if you notice in my paper, I'm using pen. When you go on your panel, make sure that you're using graphite or charcoal for your grid. That way it'll mix in with your paint when you get started. So like I said, think about this as a proportional tool. You want to start with the big shapes. Oops, misspelling there. Big shapes, I mean. And I'm going to just repeat the same thing that I just did on my board. So I'm going to go corner to corner, right? So nice and even. Apologize, it's a little hard to see just because the panel's so white. Go corner to corner, middle to middle. Um, and then I'm going to connect the middles. Make sure you're using a nice big straight edge because it'll mess you up if you don't. Having a nice yardstick or something like that helps. Since we're not measuring, we're just kind of connecting the edges. As long as it's a hard straight edge, it doesn't have to have any measuring on it if you need something that's bigger. I'm going to connect the middle of those X's, right? And then at this point, I'm just going to go in and draw more lines in the squares where I feel like I needed the more detail. So I got to look at my paper, make sure they're in the same spots. So I'm going to go to that middle square where the hand was and divide that out. Make sure you have it in the right spot, right? I want to make sure it's in the same square. Divide it out more where I wanted it divided out. And then I'm going to go down in the bottom left, do the same thing where I decided I needed more for the foot. Like I said, the unique thing about this, even if as I get started drawing, if I decide I need to divide it more in one spot or another, you can go ahead and divide that more. So like I said, you're using this as sort of a proportional tool. So map out your big shapes first, then go into the details. Don't get into the little fussy details yet because you're going to get into that when you get into the paint. But you want to have everything mapped out while it's a little bit easier proportionally with your pencil while you still have this grid in place. So those kind of little details you're going to want to use your, while you have the grid in place. Right, like I said, this isn't required, but it's just another gridding method that you can use to help you with your underdrawing for this piece.